Good afternoon. My name is Eric Jones, and I'm director of the Robert Schuman Center. It's my great pleasure to welcome you here this evening to talk about the European Union and the United Kingdom in the aftermath, or actually in the context of this ongoing war initiated by Russia against Ukraine. Now, obviously, the UK-EU relationship is a complicated one. It's also supremely important. And thirdly, that relationship is constantly at a state of tension that's having an impact on relations within Europe, on relations between Europe and the United Kingdom, and on relations across the Atlantic. So trying to understand whether the UK-EU relationship can improve, whether that tension can be resolved, is central in many ways to conversations that we're having here at the European University Institute, not least because the UK used to be a critical member state of our institution. In trying to figure out a relationship between the UK and Europe is fundamental to trying to figure out a relationship between the UK and the European University Institute. Now, we see that there may be an opportunity in the context of the solidarity that's arisen in this war in Ukraine. And this renewal of solidarity creates a window. We need to understand how big of a window, how important of an opportunity this really is. And we are very fortunate to be joined today by someone who can actually shed light on that in a way very few people can. And that's Ivan Rogers, who was at one point during the whole initiation of the Brexit saga, the permanent representative of the United Kingdom to the European Union. Now, Ivan Rogers is a representative not just of the United Kingdom to the European Union at a particularly historical point in time, but also of a civil service tradition that's very difficult to find in other countries, particularly my own country, the United States. He was trained initially at Oxford. He went back to Oxford as an historian to do a PhD on eugenics, decided that instead of doing that, completing that dissertation, so he's an ABD recipient, all but dissertation, he went off to have a career in the civil service. If I remember correctly, he started out in social services, but then was seconded to Treasury, where he worked with Kenneth Clarke, a conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer. He then went on to advise government officials, both from the Conservative Party and from New Labour. He worked very closely with Tony Blair and then with Gordon Brown, ever increasingly on issues related to Europe. He became the principal advisor on European affairs to David Cameron, and then went off to be the UK's permanent representative. So in other words, Ivan Rogers comes not from an ideological position in this conversation, but rather from the position of someone who's worked very closely serving his government in order to promote British interests in the context of European integration. And yet, in the middle of 2017, or actually at the end of 2017, he took the very controversial decision to leave as UK's permanent representative, in protest in part, if my memory serves me correctly, to the direction of policy that was being followed in the negotiations between the government of the time, Theresa May's, and the European Union. Since then, he has not worked for the British government, but has instead been advising different banks and firms and other institutions, speaking also in public as often as he can, trying to explain the situation as it's been unfolding, finally through the whole Brexit and then into its aftermath. Having done that for so many years, and with the background that he brings with him, both in policy and now more recently in this private sector role, he is perfectly well equipped to take us into a narrative that relies on an understanding of the very particular British context, how that context has changed, and how the relationship between the UK and the European Union has changed along with it. So I hope you'll join me in thanking Ivan Rogers for coming to speak to us this evening, and we look forward to his presentation. For those of you who are online, I should say that the presentation will be posted as a written document online after the conclusion of this event and will be accessible, therefore, to anyone who wants to read it. But Ivan, thank you so much for being here. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Eric, for that introduction and indeed for inviting me. Really delighted to be here, honoured to be here. My first visit here. I've always wanted to come here. Thanks also for reminding me of my many career mistakes over many decades. Yes, I think you can see how unfailingly I managed to get myself into difficult positions and failed to get out of them until I managed. It was actually at the beginning of 2017 that I managed to quit the UK government, which I can't say I have ever regretted in the light of the experience of the last 5 or 6 years, I certainly don't. Now, as you say, the question you've asked me to address today is a simple one, but unfortunately the answer is anything but. And it is, does this current severe global crisis, more properly perhaps the conjunction of several multiple crises, represent the first serious post-Brexit opportunity to reset the UK-EU relationship on more positive foundations, 6 years this month since we voted to leave? Those 6 years have mostly been characterised by deepening political mistrust, punctuated by outbursts from both sides about the outrageousness of the behaviour of the other party. I appreciate this is quite a difficult week, but maybe they're nearly all difficult weeks in which to tackle this question, and recent events in London make it more difficult to speak with confidence about the future, even the future up until the end of the summer, let alone beyond it. But I'm going to get my crystal ball out anyway and try and offer you a reading on the grounds. At least that will provide you some entertainment. So where are we following the no confidence vote on Prime Minister Johnson on Monday? Well, you all saw that drama. He survived it, but severely weakened, with the great bulk of his own backbenchers clearly having voted against him. By the great bulk, I mean 70 to 75% of his own backbenchers. Even the party's house journal, the Daily Telegraph, described his authority as crushed. Now, typically of the man, I only worked for him as Foreign Secretary for a few months, but I got to know him over that time. And typically of the man, he has no intention of reading the room in his party or beyond it. So I expect him to batter on. He will think he can get through this and fight the next general election as a Conservative Party leader. He may well be right, but he will try harder, I think, to appease the forces of the right, who are the likeliest to have another go at decapitating him unless he does their bidding. And so as a consequence, the UK government later this week, no, I think actually early next, now after the news we have today, will introduce legislation essentially enabling it not to apply those provisions of the Northern Ireland Protocol which it doesn't wish to implement in any fashion that the 27 member states would agree. Now, on this occasion, unlike with the Internal Market Bill, which caused a similar sort of furore a couple of years ago, the UK government is not attempting to argue that this is a limited and specific breach, as they called it, rather laughably, of international law. It maintains this time round that its actions are legal, citing the novel concept of primordiality to explain why it can implement a version of the protocol out of line with the text that it agreed, but which the government regards as faithful to the Good Friday Agreement of 1998, to which it accords this primordial status. Now, for those here in Florence, I think it'll be pretty obvious, and for many of you online, it'll be pretty obvious that the EU will inevitably view that legal claim as wrong, as bogus, indeed as outrageous, and it's therefore bound to commence legal proceedings against the UK. Further, I think the EU will view the threat to rewrite the protocol unilaterally in UK legislation as self-evidently in bad faith, as an extraordinarily hostile step to take at this geopolitical juncture, and frankly as warranting retaliatory safeguard measures, as they are called in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. In other words, there'd be no legal need for the EU to wait until the legislation actually appeared on the statute book. We can discuss that separately. That might well take at least a year from here, because there'll be a lot of trouble in the Lords in particular. There would be no legal need for the EU to wait until legislation is passed in both houses of the UK legislature and on the UK statute book before initiating retaliatory action. That's certainly my view, and I'm sure it'll be the EU's view. And the very fact of tabling the legislation will be seen to indicate the absence of any seriousness in London about finding any negotiated solutions consistent with the text of the protocol that the 27 do not intend to reopen. So what will happen next on the Northern Ireland Protocol? If that's where we are, do we just need to recognise that negotiations around the implementation of the protocol have broken down, that neither side now has the appetite to pursue them, and that it's simply a question of the extent and the speed of the collateral damage? With London basically concluding that there is a dividend, substantive and political for itself, from establishing new facts on the ground, presumably with the expectation that ultimately the EU would learn to live with them and would be unable or unwilling ever to impose any costs which would be punitive enough for London to change its mind. If so, London's building its hopes on the impact of the UK's role in the Ukraine crisis, particularly for Poland and the Baltic states, but as ever, in my view, not appreciating that its approach is designed to entrench the EU in its current position. And with the EU concluding that with a combination of legal action, the freezing of the entire so-called positive agenda of things in which London is interested in making any progress, and targeted retaliatory safeguard measures, it can elevate the cost to London to such an extent as to force a reversal of policy, which again I think probably misreads how London, certainly under Boris Johnson, would inevitably react. Both sides, I think, are likely to want to sustain the illusion that space for negotiations remains just about open this summer, but the reality would seem to be that this is primarily about not wanting to take any blame for bringing those negotiations formally to an end. The Northern Ireland Protocol dispute will therefore remain as a crucial, perhaps the crucial impediment to any improvement in the UK-EU relationship, at least for the years that remain of this Parliament, UK Parliament, and of the European Commission. Both sides continue to misread each other's political incentives and reaction functions, as economists would call them, and the dispute over the protocol is only ever likely to be solved on terrain which one side or the other cannot access politically or doesn't wish to. Now, with Northern Ireland as the dominant issue, relations will probably continue to deteriorate rather than improve in the next couple of years. And I can testify here today that that's a view shared by multiple sources I have in multiple capitals in the European Union, as well as in Brussels. And to tell the dismal truth, that might suit both parties, at least in terms of short-term political position, even if it results in a trade war that none of us needs or can really afford at this juncture. Because one can readily sell to one's own political constituency that it's the intransigence or unilateralism of the other side which has brought the trade war about. So, this makes the question we're here to discuss today, whether the current global crisis creates any opportunities for improvements in relationships, even more important, while at the same time creating, to put it mildly, a difficult context for securing those opportunities. Where next then for the Conservative government and the EU? Well, as we've seen, the political reality is that we're yet again in a very febrile period of Conservative politics. Monday is now most unlikely to have been the last leadership contest of this Parliament, in my view. All putative leadership candidates, notably those who voted Remain, including the current Foreign Secretary, will be desperate to demonstrate to the Conservative Party grassroots that their Brexit credentials are impeccable. No leadership candidate with genuine aspirations to win can afford to say anything, though they may well think it, which suggests that the protocol issue is being badly mishandled by the Prime Minister, the Foreign Secretary, and the Attorney General. Likewise, no candidate can intimate that there's rather a lot wrong and missing with the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or that the economic consequences to the UK of a failed negotiation of that agreement are becoming ever clearer. Those things are still unsayable by those with any pretensions to power in the Conservative Party. Now, it's of course just a matter of time, frankly, before a senior Conservative says that the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as well is a botched and bad deal, and claims that this stems from us having had to negotiate it under duress and under huge time pressure. I guarantee you that will happen within a year or two. This situation can be massively comforting, perhaps too comforting, to EU elites, let's be honest, in this room. In their view, I sort of generalise, the last several years have seen a series of major EU tactical negotiating victories in successive negotiations over the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, which have delivered economic outcomes rather heavily tilted in the EU's favour. And as the noises change in London from this is a great oven-ready deal, this is the FTA of our dreams which restores UK sovereignty and makes us a nimble, independent coastal state, and increasingly those get replaced in conservative circles with this deal is an intolerable assault on UK sovereignty, humiliatingly imposed on us by the EU at a moment of national weakness. And the dividends of Brexit are not materialising because of betrayals by an establishment which never believed enough in true Brexit and is intent on subverting or reversing it. As we get all that, I detect a tendency in most capitals to think that's a tribute to how easily the EU held together in the face of British attempts to split it, and a testament to how dishonest and dismal the UK side was and remains. And the more one hears from UK government ministers and former negotiators that Brexit risks failing solely because true Brexit has not been properly tried, a sort of uncanny echo of the language of revolutionary ultra-leftists during the Cold War when accounting for all the failures of real existing socialism in the Soviet Union, the greater the reassurance to EU elites, I think. But if that reassurance is due to a sense that proponents of Brexit are finally getting a reality check and might act on that, I think that's based on a misunderstanding of the revolutionary mindset. The bravado of we got it done, they said it couldn't be done, but we got it done, progressively now gives way to it's failing only because it's not being implemented with sufficient belief and vigour. The view that its liberatory potential has been subverted by those who have insufficient faith. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer themselves are already being perceived to have feet of clay, to be tax raisers, not tax cutters. And the true believers in Brexit show some signs of concluding they must try and defenestrate Boris Johnson because he was an apostate whose heart was never sufficiently in it. Meanwhile, EU leaders can take great comfort watching a UK government whose ideas of divergence from the European regulatory order seem mostly to consist in rather vacuous acts of populist performative divergence, rather than any serious programme of economic reform. That's all quite gratifying, I think, in lots of elites, particularly at a time of major other crises, when they see what they view as the emptiness, the incompetence, the chicanery, the charlatanry, the egregious bad faith in trumpeting and marketing deals as huge triumphs and then reopening them and repudiating them as dreadful affronts to UK sovereignty. When it's clear from public papers that it was entirely clear to everyone who signed it, including the Prime Minister, that the protocol entailed a trade border in the Irish Sea. The entire Johnson premiership, in my view, makes it incredibly easy not really to have to think seriously about the British question. And who wants to think about the British question right now? Not anybody I know in other capitals. And the greatest failure of British statecraft, or rather its absence in the last several years, has been that at no stage has the UK negotiating strategy really forced the EU to think harder about what it actually wanted from the future relationship with the UK. It's been easy and comfortable for the EU simply to keep rebuffing the more obviously absurd have your cake and eat it demands from the British side, and to keep making it clear that the negotiating outcome is really a derivative, a function of British preferences. You've ended up here because of your own desiderata made it impossible to end up anywhere else. Your fault. Now, I have to be honest in concluding the first section of this talk. While Johnson is still Prime Minister, I confess I now find it very hard to imagine the EU's posture changing. It's perfectly possible it could outlive him, actually, if an incoming new Conservative Prime Minister were to inherit the protocol dispute in essentially the state we're now in this summer. But there does come a point, and in my view that point is obviously now, and this appalling war marks it, at which reconciling ourselves to a protracted frozen conflict, I use the term deliberately, the echoes deliberately, a frozen conflict across the Channel, with virtually no positive business transacted between the two sides except for over the response to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's simply not sustainable. I mean, ennui on the European side, dealing with a government which proclaims a treaty as a triumph and 18 months later says the same treaty was only agreed under severe duress and is constitutionally intolerable, is very understandable. But it's not really a policy. So people ask me, and they do ask me quite often, well, what would you have us do differently? Why, at a time when the rules-based international order is under threat from authoritarian governments worldwide, should we indulge a UK government which thinks it's fine and legal unilaterally to repudiate a treaty we signed and ratified with it? And again, I'm afraid I have to be brutally honest, I have no good glib answer to that, except probably to say that the absence of any long-term wisdom coming from Prime Minister Johnson doesn't have to be met completely by the same elsewhere. All I can really argue at this point, and I know it may not be convincing, is that the alternative to the negotiation of a solution which can stick and which has to stick on the ground in Northern Ireland by commanding consent across Northern Ireland communities, any alternative to that self-evidently is much worse. Intractable solutions do require some bravery. They're not getting bravery from London. They may need bravery from elsewhere. Because in the end, if unilateral UK rewriting or repudiation is met with a wider freeze, legal action and retaliatory escalation, and that's, I think, where we're going, then a wider trade war becomes completely inevitable. And at some point, maybe months down the track, but it may not even be months down the track, the question of whether all the trade elements of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement should also be suspended or terminated then comes on the table. And the incentives on both sides then become about how much asymmetrical punitive damage they can inflict on each other. And then there's going to be no easy way out of it, out of that spiral, and the politics on both sides are probably more likely to fuel the spiral than to terminate it. I was reading the other day that Christopher Clark's brilliant work, and it is a brilliant work, Sleepwalkers on the run-up to World War I, remains required reading in Berlin establishment circles. It used to be in Merkel's days, on the question of the handling of Moscow right now, so as to try and avoid a generation-scarring post-Versailles Treaty political reaction in what remains of the Muscovite elite. But perhaps we should apply some of the lessons of Sleepwalkers to the question we're discussing here as well. This issue is of such significance, and the highly probable consequences will have such an impact on relationships that in the next couple of years, it will quite possibly crush the positive opportunities that we're here to discuss. And nevertheless, those opportunities exist, and I want to devote the rest of this talk to them, because I think they could take us in the direction we so badly need, not a return to the past, but a new way forward. I've got 5 points, really, on the new way forward. But the first thing to say is I've never thought that the Northern Ireland Protocol and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement negotiated by David Frost was a robust or durable political framework for the EU-UK relationship. It was always thin, fragile, and pretty unlikely to last long. Now, I remain convinced, and there'll be some in this room and certainly beyond it who don't agree with me, that the UK will not rejoin the European Union, certainly any time soon, in my view, much longer than that. And indeed that the post-Brexit institutional developments on EU spending, next generation EU, borrowing, and now defence, all made much easier at 27 by the absence of the UK, let's be honest, make that inconceivable for any political party, make it inconceivable for any political party with aspirations to win in the UK to advocate rejoin. That's not going to happen at the next election. It won't happen at the election after that, in my view. The real question, therefore, always was, certainly in my time, both as Sherpa and permanent representative, and remains, whether we now stagger into something even worse than the protocol and TCA relationship, and live for years with a frozen conflict with isolated pockets of cooperation, or whether we can find a politically viable way for both sides to turn the page and deliver something more sustainable and more sensible. And it's in that spirit I offer some modest thoughts as to what both sides need to do, just not in any expectation that either side is going to do so. But there will be a world, one of these days, after the current mistrustful paralysis ends, and sooner or later we're going to need fresh ideas for it. So 5 points are, the first is build on what's going well. We should at least try and build on what's gone well in the last 100 days. We face the most dangerous, brutal, flagrant, repellent aggression on European soil for 80 years, or nearly 80 years, and this crisis marks a genuine Zeitenwende, necessitating reappraisal both of our security and our economic architecture, and of many of our domestic and international policy settings. These are still very early days in what I think is obvious will be a protracted set of crises. But the response of the US, the EU, and the UK has, whatever else, been more coherent, more determined, less mercantilist, and less frankly self-deluding than our collective response to the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014. And I was the UK's permanent representative at that time in Brussels. On sanctions, the UK started off rather slowly, bedeviled rather bizarrely by a post-Brexit legal framework which seemed to have made the adoption of effective sanctions much more difficult than in the EU regime, which the UK system had actually done so much to create. But that problem has now been addressed, and the three systems are pretty much in lockstep on sanctions within a G7 conversation. That intensity of cooperation has to extend well beyond the sanctions arena in the coming months and years, and our collective security and prosperity depends on our ability to strengthen the collective resilience of others in the liberal democratic camp, not just ourselves. And we also have to render that collective camp systematically more appealing than the camp of authoritarian rivals. I want to come back to the implications of some of that and the broader economic and regulatory values policy agenda shortly. Second point, we need to recognize our collective security is still an essential mutual interest. It's an existential issue for us both. Now, some in the EU, in my view erroneously, read the UK's so-called integrated review of its foreign and defence policy as indicating a loss of interest in the European theatre with an Indo-Pacific tilt in security to match the economic diversification tilt in UK trade policy. And this wasn't helped by the absurd desire in the document not to mention the EU as a collective entity, except as analogous, which of course it isn't, to other multilateral institutions. Indeed, it's precisely because it isn't remotely analogous to other multilateral institutions in its reach and the nature of its governance that the Brexiteers wanted to leave it. The current UK government is, I'm afraid to say, wedded to a bilateralist interstate view of the world, which is of course not the reality that any of the 27, even its major powers, inhabit anymore, nor want to. But I do think the crisis has amply demonstrated that the UK still recognises that the primary security threat on which it can and must play a major role is in this hemisphere. And it still cares about the eastern frontier, from the Nordics and the Baltics to the Balkans, and it still intends to play a serious operational role. I think that should be unequivocally welcome to the EU, as should its very important role on supplying weaponry and training in Ukraine, where I think the UK has done pretty well, both in the recent past and over recent years, because that effort started, well back under Cameron and was continued under May. I don't want to be too caustic here about concepts of strategic autonomy. It's a whole separate debate. And anyway, I welcome a stronger, more concerted EU defence effort personally. But there's no version of EU defence strategic autonomy which is viable for the foreseeable future. And the UK will, in any event, remain core to the EU's or the European autonomous capability, even, perhaps especially, in a world in which a different US administration takes a different view about the scale of the US's commitment to European liberty. So the question we actually face is how best we work together on maximising capability efficiently, which includes some very difficult questions over future complex weapons procurement, on which we may well be divided. We have to do this in ways which don't impinge on UK sovereignty in a way that's intolerable to the current or probably future UK administrations, and don't impinge on EU decision-making autonomy. No easy matter. But both sides here do have to stop fighting the last war. The UK is no longer a member, and consequently it no longer has a veto over CSDP developments, which it might have wanted to thwart had it remained. Most of my instructions were about thwarting it when we remained. When I was permanent representative. Nor could the UK expect massive German rearmament, which in these gruesome circumstances the UK must welcome, to take place wholly outside of the European policy framework. That again is historically illiterate. Many of the requisite policy decisions can be made in NATO. Many of the discussions that the Brits and others need to have can be conducted bilaterally, but not all. And Putin has provided more impulsion to more serious moves towards EU rearmament, defence integration and rationalisation alongside NATO than anyone in the last 2 or 3 generations. The UK can no more stop those moves from outside the club than it could veto the doubling of the own resources ceiling or prevent massive new borrowing by the Commission under the next generation EU. It's time to recognise too that when the Danes end their defence policy opt-out, thus moving in precisely the opposite direction from that confidently predicted to me by Brexiteers 5 years ago, that's part of the same phenomenon as Finnish or Swedish NATO accession. It's not an opposed phenomenon. Putin has enabled both. One benefit of Brexit, and I don't mean this sarcastically, could perhaps be the UK ceasing to obsess about the theological failings of the church it's left. What matters is collective capability and resilience. If the EU can find ways to help its member states spend more and with less gross inefficiency than they do currently, a sane UK government should be completely welcoming. Third point, we need to recognise the scale of the challenge to the policy framework of the last 30 years, the policy framework that's dominated my life in EU and international financial relations. This crisis calls into question, or simply torpedoes really, both the style of globalisation of the last 30 years and your domestic economic policy settings. And it requires the liberal democratic world to think radically differently and together about both. As I said earlier, the European and UK and indeed US response, obviously, to Putin's earlier military adventures was a combination of complacency, wish fulfillment, and delusion. That applies above all, in my view, but not solely, to German energy policy, which was driven by an industrial manufacturing policy elite which depended on Russian raw materials and energy and was entirely and wrongly relaxed about doing so. I hear that regularly from good German sources. And that essentially determined German foreign policy and thus heavily influenced European foreign policy. Or should I say a bit more provocatively in this room, it contributed via mercantilism obsessed with running large trade surpluses to ensuring that there never has been, or there never could be to date, a strategic EU foreign policy. But it also applies to the woeful inability of the British political elite to tackle the London money laundromat, indeed to regard attracting kleptocrats and kleptocrats' dirty money as part of its business model. So welcome though it is to see scales finally fall from eyes in both those capitals and in many others, and in EU institutions, I do think we are a long way off still internalising what all this means for both European and British economic policy. First, and most obviously, however impressive it's been to see the degree of unity on severe sanctions to date in comparison to the disunity of 2014, really to terminate Russia's ability to finance its aggression, you must hit its current account surplus, which has actually increased sharply during the war. That ultimately means a full energy embargo, further than we've so far been able to go for entirely understandable reasons, but precisely because of the policy naivety and errors of decades past. We're going to have to get there, in my view. I regret saying that, given, I don't want an intractable and terrible relationship with Moscow, but I think we're going to have to get there. And doing so requires radical thinking not only of our energy policy models, but of an economic model, notably in Germany, that was predicated on that model. Secondly, I think the fantasy, and maybe it always was a fantasy, of a rules-based liberal international order encompassing the entire globe is disintegrating. Maybe that's exaggerated, but I don't think it is. This fragmentation into competing models, aggressive, more closed regionalism with contestation over values, rules and standards, and with trade and investment flows dictated much more by the need for national or regional resilience than by the need for just-in-time efficiency, is simply not the early century multilateralism of either EU or Brexit Britain dreams. It's obviously also inflationary, which makes me doubt even more than I did before the transitoriness of inflation. And with a renewed focus on fiscal policy, I think debt issuance will ultimately cease to be the easy option, both in the UK and in the EU, which in turn points to higher, not lower taxation, and to a squeeze on corporate earnings. US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen gave a very interesting speech in April, and when talking about the need for friendshoring, a word I deplore, but you understand what it means, friendshoring supply chains amongst allies with democratic values, again, resiliency and national security prioritized over efficiency, she said, quote, "We cannot allow countries to use their market position in key raw materials, technologies and products to have the power to disrupt our economy or exercise unwanted geopolitical leverage." Now that's directed obviously overwhelmingly at China and Russia, but its whole logic is a fundamental challenge to EU and UK economic and foreign policy. The EU's, as I've said, because the mercantilist German model in particular has relied on secure and relatively cheap Russian energy to sustain a massive manufacturing base, exporting heavily to and investing heavily in China. A huge debate I won't get into, but it looks increasingly strategically likely to be an unsustainable choice. The UK's model under severe threat because the vision of global entrepot Britain, freed of deep entanglement with its home bloc, able nimbly to diversify by securing preferential trade deals, values-free with every bloc on the planet, a sort of glorified national Singapore, while striking out in different deregulatory direction from both the EU and US in order to maximize its competitive advantage. That doesn't easily survive contact with a world in which supply chains prioritize shortness, values friendliness, and resilience over efficiency, and in which the need for a consistent liberal democratic economic model to promote and propagate against those of authoritarian regimes in perhaps the major conflict of systems in the coming decades, points to the need for greater, not lesser, regulatory homogeneity. And that means on data, on internet, on AI, on telecoms, on satellites, on batteries. And the need for much more systematic joint working on defense, on rare earths, on energy security, food security, competition policy, and plenty more. And to be clear, those cannot, if the competition is primarily with the Chinese model, which I think it is, those can't just be blah blah discussions within the liberal democratic bloc ending in delivering aspirational declaratory communiques. They're going to have to be substantive, deep discussions with operational consequences, legal consequences, including for private sector operators, where parties are taking binding legal commitments to action which impinge on their own sovereign choices. Now, that's not to argue, I hope, for a monotype in future Western capitalism. The essence of a more localist, less old-style globalist response to these crises has to leave more space for local social preferences. I think we should have learned that lesson from Brexit, from Trump, and from many other things. Socially, that makes a good deal of sense, although I emphasize, economically, it adds to inflation risks and inflation longevity. But it is to argue that in a plethora of policy areas, security, resilience, values will increasingly trump economic efficiency. And developing concerted liberal democratic regulatory regimes which are open to others to join is going to become more appealing because it's more essential to winning any global economic conflict. Now, I can well see this view meeting resistance from plenty of forces, ranging from German and no doubt Italian and French and other two corporatists who prefer something closer to strategic equidistance between the US and China and Russia, put cynically for the sake of their balance sheets, as well as from Brexiteer deregulators who don't want to be hobbled by these ghastly regulatory superpowers from being global entrepot Singapore on Thames. But my view is the world's getting rather cold for both of those views. Now, I want to build on that in my fourth point, which is I think we need to recognize and we need to find the right forums, the right fora for the development of a new policy framework to manage whatever the new globalization or the new version of globalization or deglobalization proves to be. We need to view these discussions, maybe you should view them as the economic, strategic and regulatory counterpart to NATO discussions on defense. They need to happen somewhere. And it's clear, at least as regards the EU and UK, but I think it's broader than that, there's no current venue. When I say it's broader than that, By definition, with the G20 membership splintering, that's not a forum where you can replicate for any of these issues the success it briefly had under Gordon Brown's chairmanship at the height of the global financial crisis. The G20 is on its, I wouldn't say it's on its last legs, but it's very difficult to see what it's going to be able to do over the next few years, and it's not going to be the forum in which the Western liberal democratic world is comfortable very much, nor will the Chinese or the Russians. There may be stuff you can do on climate finance and one or two other things, but I wouldn't overstate it. The WTO remains on life support, and it may struggle to find a purpose in a world in which globalization fragments and truly multilateral rules and multilateral global deals become a thing of the past. And it is, in any case, simply the wrong institution for the bulk of these issues. And nor, self-evidently, are the other Bretton Woods institutions the right institutions for the issues. The G7, perhaps a G7 plus format, can take forward some discussions like those on sanctions or other elements of the immediate strategic response to the Ukraine war. It can catalyse on issues ranging from tax to climate finance to vaccines, albeit, as we've seen, with highly variable success and generally quite poor follow-through. But in my experience as UK G7 Sherpa, and I've been G7 Sherpa twice, both for Cameron and for Blair, the G7 is most unlikely to be able to bear the load of multiple, much deeper regulatory and economic resilience discussions where initial views, even amongst the Western world, may diverge widely, but where the new model multilateralism within the democratic bloc requires more convergence to develop a model that others can and actually want to import. Bilaterally, of course, between the superpowers, and by the superpowers I mean the EU and US, there is, of course, the Trade and Technology Council, and the early signs on that seem to me pretty good and suggest that some key lessons at least have been learned from the whole TTIP experience, which I went through for many years, both in London and in Brussels. And the EU may conclude, understandably, it's a much more important forum with the US in which to make agreements than any forum involving the UK. If you can resolve issues over data protection and privacy, or over AI, or over competition, or over digital markets with the US, why do you bother excessively about the UK? Why equally, if you're the US, would you spend as much time bothering with the UK on those issues as with the EU? It's not obvious to me. What the two great blocs can agree, and it'll all be difficult to agree anything, will by definition, though, largely constrain and prescribe what other democracies do in a world where data and much else is ceasing to be borders. But the UK is absent. It'll never be a third wheel in that forum and won't be invited in by either side. It's nothing really analogous to those issues in its own trade and cooperation agreement with the EU, not least because, although it talked a good game endlessly about demanding to be treated as a sovereign equal, this phrase was repeated, upwards of 100 times, felt like more than 1,000 times by the British negotiator, always asserted sort of saloon bar style as if it was a sign of national self-confidence, but always actually indicating precisely the loss of it, I think, in a government out of its depth. It takes a ridiculously outdated view of what free trade consists in, or can now ever consist in, I think, in 2022. Free trade, freeing trade, is overwhelmingly about chiseling away at complex behind-the-border barriers. It's about standards. It's about cross-border services provision, all of which is difficult to liberalise. It's about public procurement and competition rules. It's about regulatory convergence. And as I say, it's increasingly about the values which underpin regulatory regimes of the free world as against the unfree world. Now, in my view, the UK will sooner or later, unless it's taken leave of its senses in perpetuity, will come back to a realisation that if it wants a serious role in setting future global governance in the free world, a bunch of thin free trade agreements with various partners around the world doesn't cut it, and the UK is going to have to come back to some table. But my point is simply, we have to develop that table, and I'm fairly agnostic as to where that table is, but I know it doesn't currently exist. And the fifth and final point I want to make before I wrap up is to say, tackle today's questions today and make progress in areas where there's scope for some movement. Avoid thinking one can solve many of the acute problems in the UK relationship by going back to discussions of architecture. There are huge issues for the EU to confront, in my view, over enlargement to the Western Balkans, and obviously now to Ukraine and Moldova. I've been part of those conversations in Brussels for years. It's nothing to do with us Brits anymore. One of the many manifestations of the UK's reduced importance in the economics of geostrategic issues in our own region. But that's what we chose. There's no going back. And there remain some hard security contributions we can and must make, even if some are ancillary to the main event, which will be still an accession negotiation. I remain a great enthusiast for EU enlargement, notably in the Western Balkans, which are and will remain, I think, a key cauldron of the conflict between systems which we've long actually known that we face, but we now confront in much clearer and more existential terms post the Ukraine war. I personally do think that the EU does have seriously to rethink the enlargement process, and it does have to develop a conception of its wider neighbourhood, which is a bit less formulaic and a bit less technocratic and a bit less trade deal dominated than hitherto. But my point for this discussion is simply this: the UK is a sui generis issue for the EU, which can't easily, maybe at all, be fitted into a wider template. There might have been a moment, even post-Lisbon, and I thought about that obviously a lot in my last 2 jobs in the system. And frankly, even then it's not obvious. There might have been a moment when a Eurosceptic Conservative government might have been able to deliver a reasonably durable political settlement, with the UK remaining in the base layer of integration, as I would call it, the single market, much of which, after all, the UK played a key role in designing, and the customs union, but absenting itself basically in perpetuity from all other clubs as new chantier of integration opened up. There might have been that moment. I could write a long book on that question as to whether that moment ever existed, or whether it had closed by the time of the Lisbon Treaty. But it's gone now. There might have been a moment on exiting the European Union where, instead of taking the rather bizarre customs union, quasi-customs union route that Theresa May ended up proposing, predictably failing entirely both with her own party and with the European Union, instead of doing that, we quit the customs union in order to be able to be free to set our own sovereign trade policy. We left other common EU policies, obviously regional policy and agricultural policy, but we tried to negotiate a version of single market membership which was sort of EFTA-ish, but with British characteristics. I thought about that a great deal, as you could imagine, both before the referendum and afterwards. But the primacy of ending the free movement question for Theresa May, plus the obvious rule-taking issues for the UK, which, let's be candid, are much less tractable issues than they are for Norway, ruled that out as a runner completely in 2016, the moment Theresa May entered Downing Street. You don't, in my view, go back to such questions with profit now. Even once we're through the phase that we remain in with the Conservatives, namely that the only true version of Brexit is the hardest possible one because everything else is treason and betrayal. Even when we're through that phase, I don't think there's great profit in reopening the whole kind of, is there a version of EFTA EEA that might work for the British? Because I think the answer is going to be no. None of this, of course, was said to the British public before the referendum or during the referendum campaign in 2016. So don't get me wrong. It wasn't what was promised on the tin, but nevertheless, going back to that discussion 6 years on, I think is an unprofitable route. This phase will eventually pass. I just can't tell you exactly when. But even amidst the revolutionary Praetorian Guard, you can feel the growing unease in the UK in the face of realities. The louder and more bellicose some of these people get, the more worried they are. That's an iron law. When it does pass, whoever is in office in London, we do need to focus in my view, starting bottom up, not top down. Though clearly, like any negotiation, it's going to need a serious package of potentially deliverable agreements in order for there to be enough political interest in it in both sides. We're going to need a whole series of agreements on pragmatic things where both sides know the present settlement is either deficient or silent or basically crap. And a lot of the real people, the bureaucrats, know that on both sides, but we're not able to tackle that for political reasons, and that moment is not coming this side of the UK general election. This is no easy matter, but there is a plethora of those issues, from a new mobility agreement which addresses some of the more damaging lunacy of the current settlement, to an asylum and readmissions legal agreement, from the defence procurement issues I discussed, which are going to be central to kind of European collective rearmament, to research and scientific cooperation, which we're in the process of damaging the relationship, because I'm pretty sure the UK will be out of Horizon 2020 and will announce its own separate package soon. From deep energy and food security cooperation, in which the UK and the EU ought to be able to work together, climate finance, disclosure rules, serious collaboration on policy towards sub-Saharan Africa, again, the theatre of some very difficult discussions or contests with appealing authoritarian competition. All of that, plus the more prosaic but crucial work of actually facilitating cross-channel trade in ways that both sets of authorities can agree. One of the great missing things in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement is a much more serious trade facilitation package. I deeply regret that. I was discussing it before the referendum as a putative outcome of a trade and cooperation agreement with people in Brussels. I do think we could and should have done better. It required the preparation to have gone in on both sides. It required a level of trust that simply doesn't exist between them. But my point is, there are loads of, some people in this room and beyond it may say second order issues, but they won't be second order issues if you start mounting them up. And medium longer term, I still remain optimistic, contrary to my reputation, that quite a deep, effective EU-UK relationship can be built, despite the last several years, and despite the current very bitter impasse. And actually, these very dark days of Russian aggression have given me more optimism about the longer term perspective. But shorter term, I'm afraid I have to end here. Let's not delude ourselves. It's going to carry on being bumpy, conflictual, torturous. I think it's going to get rougher in the coming months, not smoother. Essentially, I'm afraid, because of the narcissist politics of self-preservation, which will continue to dominate in London. The job for everyone here and elsewhere who cares about the relationship and the future of liberal democracies, I think, facing far bigger first-order challenges, is to look beyond the immediate, because the immediate is going to be very bumpy and difficult, and to find the ground on which we can actually start building a relationship worth having. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much, Ivan. We do have about 37 minutes for questions and comments. For those of you who are online, what we would ask is that you put your questions in the Q&A box that you'll find in the center of your screen at the bottom, and we'll weave those into the conversation as they come in. Now, I'd like to take questions from the room. The only thing I would ask if you ask a question from the room is that you identify yourself for our speaker so that we can keep track of the question flow. If there are a lot of questions, we can take them in groups and then hand them off for response. But if the buildup of questions is relatively slow, we can always do them one at a time. I do have one question, though, while people are thinking. One question for you, Ivan. You create a situation in which there are incentives for both sides to embrace a seemingly frozen conflict, and you argue in your 5 points, or in the second of those 5 points, that nevertheless there is considerable stuff going on. In the first point, the things that are going well, and in the second, this pressure that comes from the conflict. And I guess my question is, the pressure that comes from the conflict, this recognition of the essential nature of our collective security, how long do you think that's going to last? Because if I look at the political debate here in Italy, I get the sense that people are becoming increasingly distracted by kitchen table issues that have very little to do with the conflict, and indeed are distracting them away from supporting the kind of assistance that Ukraine requires and solidarity that the Italian government would like to express.
Well, it's a great but very difficult question. We went through that in 2014, and as I said earlier, despite heroic efforts on some of our parts, I think, to put through successive sanctions packages, most of which happened after the shoot down of MH17, it was pretty limited, and the appetite didn't last long, and we were in, okay, very difficult economic circumstances then, but better than now. The risk is, you know, the cost of living crisis, the fuel security problem, the food security problem, the inflation issues erode public support. That's as true in the UK as in Italy. It'll be true elsewhere. That was always Putin's calculation. It's been a successful calculation for the last 15 years when dealing with the Western world, that ultimately they could bear much more pain than us and see it through. Obviously, they don't have problems of elections, and his calculation has always been that Western unity would fragment on the question, and there would be a divide in particular between, you know, German mercantilists and some in the south, and those in the Baltics, and the Brits and the Poles who would be more militant. Look, I don't know. I think we've done much better than I would have predicted over the first 100 days. I think that's been testament to the very good work from Blinken and team in state, Bill Burns, CIA. I think it's been a much more intelligent US. I think I said to you before we started, Eric, one interesting question for me is, have the Americans had to work harder in Brussels, both on the NATO front, but above all on the EU front, precisely because we Brits weren't there, and therefore they've done a better and more systematic job in Brussels, Berlin and Paris than when we were there. I think there is an element of that in terms of intelligence sharing and that. Does this last? Look, I think there are serious risks. There's also a serious risk that, again, for political reasons, you're seeing some of that in the UK debate already, that there'll be UK grandstanding at the expense of both Scholz and Macron. These are, you know, lily-livered, cheese-eating surrender monkeys. We Brits stand up to the Russian bear. Only we can really be trying. You know, plenty of that from the British Foreign Secretary over the last few weeks. So there's a risk that it adds to the turmoil in the relationship by the Brits telling themselves the comforting story that they, alongside the Balts and the Poles, are the only people who can be relied on. So I think there are a lot of risks. I'm a bit more optimistic from what I see and from what I hear, because I do think this stuff so far has been working well on the G7 net or G7 plus net, and the kind of economic statecraft is sticking together. And bear in mind, from the UK perspective, I know that this sounds quite mad to quite a lot of the audience who'll be on the line, but the UK government and the UK system is completely neuralgic about things that have an EU backdrop. And so if you can do things in a G7 or G7 plus frame and a state-to-state, even if the European institutions are obviously in the room, and obviously in many ways stitching together European packages, it's less threatening to people in London to do that stuff and to get stuff done and to be able to sell it as something that we are taking a leadership role in international fora without ever mentioning the EU. Some of this stuff is deeply puerile, to put it mildly, but it does enable you to make progress, and it gives us a better chance of this holding together. But, you know, we have a severe inflation cost of living crisis, and we'll see where the European publics, including the British public, are over the winter.
Super. Thank you so much, Ivan. I've got 2 questions in the room, and it looks like we've got 4 online, but it may be that I need to be made co-host in order to see those online questions. So those of you who are online, please do keep posting your questions, but we're going to work out that little technical wrinkle as this conversation goes on. Philip, I've just identified you by name, but if you could please introduce yourself, that would be very helpful.
Philip Stevens, a visiting fellow at the STG. Thank you so much. It's fascinating and brilliant as usual. I basically agree fundamentally with all your analysis, and particularly with the analysis that there isn't a deal that can be done with this government, with this Prime Minister. And I think rightly so as far as the EU is concerned, because the one thing we know about Johnson is he can't be trusted to keep any agreement that he makes. But, you know, I detect, and it's literally in the last couple of weeks, let me put you some glimmers of optimism and let you demolish them. One of them is, if you look at the threat to Johnson, it's not just from the high priests of Brexit. It's a very wide threat, if you look at those backbenchers. It includes a lot of Remainers, or not, well, such as there are in the Tory party now, but it also includes quite a lot of what you might call pragmatic Brexiters, people who were very for it and remain for it, but they don't really, you know, sleep and breathe the sort of details of, and they don't see demons across the continent. The second thing, so I think Johnson has to weigh those voices and the possibility that others will join those, as well as the voices of the high priests. The second thing is what's happened to the economy, which is slowing down, and now, as we see from the OECD forecasts yesterday, prospects, the Treasury basically agree with those forecasts, and dire, no growth, and the highest inflation in Europe, and people notice that. You know, forecasts yesterday, 1.5% growth in the euro area and 0 in the UK, 3% inflation in the euro area, 5.5%, 6% in the UK. And the third thing is that finally the Brexit impact is being disentangled from the COVID impact. So whereas before people could blame the queues at Dover on Brexit or the difficulties in exporting or whatever, and a Tory MP said this to me that a lot of small businesses in his constituency post-COVID are saying, well, it's impossible to export to Europe. So there's a bit of a pushback. Another Tory MP messaged me at the weekend. He said he'd been away from Parliament for a week, and he said he couldn't count the number of constituents that he'd talked to who'd said, these being in the slow lane at European airports and finding that they had to pay for their telephone calls on top of i.e. the eradication of roaming. I feel, and you're beginning to hear some of the Brexiters, not the mad, say, look, and actually there's an article in the Times by a chap called Ian Martin, who was one of the hardliners today, saying what we need is a sensible economic relationship with Europe. So you're beginning, as they look to their own political futures, to hear Conservatives talk not about rejoining but so I just wonder whether there isn't a glimmer. One of the candidates for who will be a candidate said to me a couple of weeks ago, and this is a question for you, so I'll end with a question. He said, what we need for the Northern Ireland agreement is a time-limited acceptance by the UK of European phytosanitary arrangements, which we can say is not an infringement of sovereignty, because we'll agree it for 5 years, 10 years, or whatever, and that will take the sting out of it in the short term, and we can come back to it after the next general election. Is that, do you think, in any way plausible?
Well, thanks, Philip. I think I agree on all 3 points. I agree the threat is wide and diffuse, which, as you would expect from 148. I think the risk is always that the right in the Conservative Party is usually better organised than anybody else, so there isn't a phalanx of people around the kind of Jesse Normans, and therefore when under severe pressure, the trolley, as Dominic Cummings calls him, tends to veer in a particular direction because he thinks the greater threat to him is from the right. But I agree the threat is diverse and more difficult to manage, and there are some people who are certainly getting fed up with the idea that the kind of Northern Ireland Protocol and being beholden to the DUP and seeing a potential trade war, if they yet understand that a trade war might be coming. Why are we, exactly why are we doing all this? I thought the Ian Martin piece was interesting, yes, because I think there is, and that's actually, of course, partly what I'm trying to do with the 5 points, to say, guys, it's perfectly possible to create a pragmatic agenda, none of which offends your precepts on sovereignty, all of which can be manufactured in ways that sound like these are excellent wins for both sides, but above all us. And, that impatience of a kind of, but this is actually obviously a crap deal and we're now recognising it, but we can't ever talk about single market and customs union membership or anything which looks architectural. So I think that is, the very fact that, the MP for Bournemouth East, okay, he's a bit of an outlier, my hometown is prepared to say publicly, okay, he got a storm of abuse for mentioning the single market question. But is that mood happening because of inflation, cost of living, the sense that we've shot ourselves in the foot and made things worse, and as you say, this growing sense that you can actually disentangle some of the kind of Brexit damage from the other damage? So I think I buy all that. I think it's a slow process. The difficulty, of course, is when it comes to the membership in the leadership election, is that when you get to the last 2 and the parliamentarians have chosen, the natural instinct of those leadership candidates will be to default to very hardline anti-EU rhetoric in the belief that that's what gets you over the line. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, yeah, he's not in that. Actually, Liz Truss wasn't, but she's concluded that that's her best way to, get to the last two, and if she can cement an ERG, European Research Group phalanx. So your SPS question, look, that is the obvious answer. It's been the obvious answer for ages. I don't think they can do it, not because they all believe in the David Frost position on SPS, which was no way, never, outrageous, and it constrains what we might be able to do in future trade deals with the US and all that stuff. The difficulty is because he and others are still out there, there's an enormous fear in the Foreign Office and obviously around Liz Truss in doing anything that can be shot down in flames on the columns of the Daily Telegraph by her predecessor. And I know this is difficult stuff for people here to understand, how on earth does British politics work like this, and how can a previous negotiator, unelected anywhere, be sort of being able to dictate policy parameters from the columns of the Daily Telegraph. But we are a bit in that world. Look, at SPS, there's loads of stuff that you could do if you wanted to be pragmatic. There are loads of other recommendations out there which would enable you to solve at least a decent proportion of the customs stuff. It's the trust question. And the problem is what you're saying. It's not just that they don't distrust. They distrust Johnson because they think he knowingly signed up and ratified something that he intended to repudiate. They distrusted Frost intensely because they thought that was the whole game all along, and the command paper was a disaster. And now they distrust Truss because, having produced their response to the command paper in October, which was a package of quite sensible measures, maybe not going far enough in certain domains from a Northern Irish perspective, I can see that, but it gets dismissed as a step backwards rather than a step forward. And so why would you trust it? As you say at the moment, if you're them in the EU, sitting in my old kind of Coreper, you would think, well, this may be a dead man walking prime minister. He may be gone in 3 to 6 months, so you certainly don't want to throw him any concessions, because we'll then have a different prime minister who will ask for a different raft of concessions. And why would you throw something to the current foreign secretary when you think that she's on manoeuvres to use a very hardline Brexit position to get the leadership? So I'm afraid if I were the French or German permanent representative or the other permanent representative looking at this equation at the moment, I would say, right, I will sit there and twiddle my thumbs and see what happens in London over the next few months.
So we've got a couple more questions online. I've got Renaud in the room. I'm just going to give you the first online question very quickly, great. Which is, why is Russia attacking right now? Is this anything to do with Brexit? This comes from Mihaila Angenita.
I don't think it has anything to do with Brexit on the specific timing, but I think the signals the West collectively has sent over recent years post-Crimea would have given them every encouragement to think that they could pull it off again. I mean, it's not wholly irrational behavior on Putin's part. He may have miscalculated grossly on the Ukrainian reaction. He may have miscalculated grossly on the ferocity now of the West's reaction and the financial sanctions. I'm sure he did. But is it wholly irrational for him, looking at the history of the last 15 years, what happened on Georgia, what happened on Crimea, how little we managed really to implement the sanctions? I work, for example, on the kind of financial sanctions, and obviously there's a package of financial, energy, defense sanctions. We've done a lot of, in my view, very good work, actually, on tax evasion, beneficial ownership, stuff for David Cameron at the G7, and he tasked me to do it, getting much more serious about economic crime, about, as I say, beneficial ownership of companies. There was a lot of good stuff done that we prosecuted and deliberately led on in 2013. I effectively discovered via this process that an awful lot of the stuff that we had pushed in our last G7 presidency when I was the Sherpa, we've yet to institute or put on the UK statute book 9 years later. So, if you're looking at the Western world from a Putin perspective, you think these people have kind of, they're short term and I'm long term. They've got elections to win. Their publics are not really up for it. They're very easily divided from each other. We have a relative, they probably thinks we have a relatively weak US president. why would you not choose the kind of early 2022 and think that you could get away with it? And, the big miscalculation was obviously the ferocity of the Ukrainian response, because he clearly thought he would be able to take over the country or take over Kiev extremely rapidly.
Renaud?
Yes, I'm Renaud Doust, the president of the EUI. And first of all, I wanted to thank you for a very complete overview of the situation, even though you did not give us much hope that clouds would disappear anytime soon. But since you did, however, show that there was still room for hope at the end of the journey, I wanted a bit in the line of Philip's remarks to ask you to help us understand what would be required, say, in terms of British politics for this to materialize. Because yes, as a functionalist, I would subscribe to your line, namely we need to identify, and when I say we, I mean, I really mean that both sides need to identify areas in which there is obvious interest in doing things together, and there is no shortage of such areas. But we know that we are where we are because of politics, because, well, many people at different points in time found it convenient to, for instance, suggest a referendum or suggest a hard Brexit and so on and so forth. And the question is, what would be required for the tide of politics to change? Maybe the kind of changes that Philip was hinting at minutes ago in his interventions. But for the time being, it's difficult to see that how one could, let's say, rally support for concrete proposals that would address things that we would regard as obvious needs, but where probably grassroots people would say, well, do we care about those things? We have more urgent concerns, and what does this bring to us? So what I lack is this political element, and I think it certainly was of primordial importance in Britain, but I'm sure it applies in other countries as well.
No, well, thanks for that. I mean, I think the first three answers are time, economic trouble or crisis, some of which is attributable to the state of the relationship, and the third may be tautologous. It's a change of political generation. I mean, I think you have to. I've lived through nearly all of this because, when I was working for Ken Clarke back in the early mid-90s as Chancellor of the Exchequer as his private secretary, we were dealing with a very small rump of Eurosceptics over the Maastricht Treaty, which is when it started to explode in conservative politics. And John Major memorably described the 9 chief opponents as bastards. At that stage, people like Ken Clarke, for whom I had a huge amount of time, and was a fundamentally different sort of conservative and a much more sort of right-wing Christian Democrat conservative from any you have now, dismissed those people as kind of fruitcakes and nutters and people going nowhere. That was obviously a big mistake. Those people have, over time, cemented their position and essentially taken over the Conservative Party, which has become a nationalist, populist party, and not a big business party, more of a small business party. And it's nothing like the Conservative Party of Douglas Hurd, Malcolm Rifkin, Ken Clarke, Leon Britton even, and Leon was much further to the right and much more Thatcherite, but nevertheless, it was possible to have a Leon Britton who was a pro-European Thatcherite. The very concept now doesn't sort of make any sense, but he was fervently pro-European as well as being extremely kind of neoliberal in his thinking. So I think the generation has to change. I mean, my point is, a lot of those people who emerged into the current Conservative Party and are now MPs grew up cutting their teeth on Brexit, leaving the EU, leaving the evil empire as the primordial issue in their politics, the key objective for their politics. The kind of Daniel Hannan types who are very prominent in the UK debate, but there are loads of those who will have fought in their constituency association and fought over 10, 15, 20 years for this as the primordial objective, liberating the country from the evil, Now, they're never going to change that view, and that is always, they matters more to them than the Ukraine-Russia war. They hate the European Union, some of these guys, far more than they hate anything else. That's not going to change, but the generation shift will. The longer you get from Brexit, the more this is going to seem a bit tiresome for the public. And the more it's not going to be the game in the late 2020s. You're 12 years on, you're already 6 years on. I find this depressingly slow. I got into huge trouble when I resigned as the man who predicted that it would take 10 years to get to the other side of Brexit. I think I underestimated really. I thought it would be long, tortuous, difficult, complex, and that we hadn't really fathomed the system-wide issues, the regime change issues in economic terms, and this would all take longer than people thought. I think that was right, but the politics evolves even more slowly. But sooner or later, people grow up with incentives. If you're a young Tory now who wants to fight the 2024 election or the 2029 election, you're not going to make your career on being an advocate of Brexit. Now, at the moment, there is this revolutionary syndrome, which we somehow have to break out of, that people, and I've talked about this in multiple different lectures, of a sort of revolutionary radicalization. It's become more and more impossible over the last 5 years to say you're a soft Brexiteer. People who were coming into my office in 2014, 2015, talking about the appeal of the Norwegian model or the Swiss model, would now deny that they did so, and would say that it's the worst model in the world and sovereignty reduces. Nigel Farage was talking reasonably amiably about the Norwegian model in 2015. We've now reached a pitch, particularly on the right of the party, which has dominated the Conservative Party for the last 20 years, where anything other than true Brexit, which is the hardest possible Brexit, which leads to sort of Singapore-on-Thames deregulation to tax cuts, etc. That's why Johnson's in trouble, and you can see that percolating from the base into the cabinet, saying we've got to be deregulatory, we've got to take the advantage of the opportunities. So what's slowing this process up at the moment is the intensification of the kind of revolutionary. The revolution is only safe if we maximize all the opportunities and we go for the most radical, hard Brexit possible. I do think that over time people are just going to get less and less interested in that, and starting to talk to the British public in the late 2020s. I mean, the next election, can you rerun the Brexit thing? Maybe a bit, and I think he intends to, which is why I'm pessimistic. I think he'll resurrect the Brexit question and accuse Keir Starmer of being a rejoiner, remainer. Well, I think that's part of the game. I think it's part of Liz Truss's game as well in terms of getting the leadership. You might get away with doing some of that and having some appeal in 2024. When you get to the general election, 2028, 29, I think much of the public will think, what the hell are these people talking about? It's like talking about the ERM crisis when you'd reach the mid-2000s. It's sort of irrelevant. And I think once you've reached that point, it becomes easier then. It's the Philip point, but I do think this Ian Martin article is interesting because he's basically saying, oh, for God's sake, this Northern Ireland Protocol can't dominate everything. We can't be at war with the European Union all the time. Isn't it time to start building a few pragmatic things that we know we need? And if you can frame it in that way and get a bit more bipartisan support for it, and if the EU is capable, the EU will have some difficulties responding to that generously and may just play its own games of saying, oh, for Christ's sake, we went through all this, back in 2019 and you didn't want it then. I hope it doesn't do that, because there will come a moment with a different Prime Minister at some point where there's a real opportunity to build something, and then you've got to get the packaging right at the outset, where the EU thinks there's enough in this that's really interesting for us, and we have a very variegated constituency within the EU, and there's enough in this for them, and we can meet somewhere in the middle without it being a defeat for anybody. And let's be honest, I mean, I've dealt a lot with the Swiss negotiations. We are like a giant version of Switzerland, only more awkward. When there were negotiations in Coreper on the institutional and juridical arrangements of Switzerland, everybody used to look at me, because they thought this is a precursor of the debate that we might be about to have with the Brits. So I think it's handling that The moment you get into juridical, institutional warfare questions, and it looks like an imperialist imposition on us, and it becomes, the Swiss got very averse to this when it became package 2 and package 3. If you end up with that, then you start to reopen all that in British politics and it becomes an architecture debate. That's my point about avoid architecture, avoid going back to single market debates, customs union debates, EEA debates, EFTA debates, Canada. Avoid the staircase graph. Don't talk about it. Just put some pragmatic propositions on the table and build a package which suits both.
So, Ivan, I have a question from Bridget Laffin, and Bridget writes, the Good Friday Agreement is simply not working anymore within Northern Ireland, north, south, east, and west. The danger after the next general election, a Sinn Féin government in Dublin will decide that its core goal of a united Ireland is better served by chaos in Northern Ireland. And so her question is, has London, not government, but key departments, any commitment to the Good Friday Agreement left? And do they have any understanding of what might be unleashed if that agreement is allowed to fail?
Well, it's a great question, and Bridget knows far more than me about the potential answer to it, except probably the London dimension. I'm very worried about it. I'm also very worried about the way in which the Good Friday Agreement and, doctrine of consent is currently being interpreted in Downing Street and around the kind of key advisors. I think the honest answer to the question across Whitehall, or most of Whitehall, including the centre, is no to that question. I don't think there's anybody around and alive involved in the system who was there at the time of the Good Friday Agreement. And Bridget will know what I mean in terms of, the Jonathan Phillips, the Jonathan Stevens, the Jonathan Powells. For some reason, they were always called Jonathan, but there was deep institutional knowledge at the centre of our system, and not just in the Northern Ireland office, about the dynamics of it. Deep historical knowledge, which maybe didn't match the Irish system's knowledge of it, but I think probably did. That's certainly not true now. And I remember after I had resigned, going to Dublin and talking to some insiders and some old friends, old Sherpa friends and Perm Rep friends, and people being a bit shocked when they had asked the Cabinet Secretary who was in charge of Ireland policy and who was really running it and who was on top of it and understood it. And the answer had come back from the Cabinet Secretary, Ollie Robbins, who was at that stage the kind of chief negotiator. And I was fairly shocked as well, because Ollie, with all respect to him, he didn't actually know very much about the European Union when he started the job, but he certainly didn't know anything about the Irish question. He hadn't got the background in it. There were one or two people in the National Security Executive and elsewhere at the centre who did at that point. But it slightly unnerved me, and I thought, we've lost the institutional knowledge. Now, one of the great things that's happened in my professional life is the improvement in Anglo-Irish relations. That's great credit to loads of people, bureaucrats and ministers and prime ministers on both sides. That sustained us, in my view, through at least 4 prime ministerships. And in fairness to Theresa May, although I, obviously had my difficulties with her and her entourage, I think she eventually tried very hard not to wreck the Northern Irish question on Brexit, which is one of the reasons why she ended up with her rather bizarre quasi-customs union approach, because it derived from that. But if I think of Major, Blair, Brown, Cameron, I can honestly say, from working within number 10 for most of them, they probably worked more on the Ireland question and the Irish peace question than any other question. And that applies to all of them. You would expect that probably of Blair, but you wouldn't expect it of Cameron. But Cameron spent more time getting his head around these issues and really trying to understand them and talking to Irish opposite numbers and understanding Northern Irish opinion. That has gone. Boris Johnson really could care less. I shouldn't say that probably in any public forum, but he wasn't really remotely interested. I'm sure there were 1 or 2 people around him, and I had hopes that John View would be one of them, the guy who essentially authored the Integrated Review and obviously has, family in Northern Ireland history. But Johnson Johnson was interested, whether you think there was substance in the interest or whether it was personal ambition, he was interested in a strongly divergent mid-Atlantic Brexit. He told me so right at the outset when he basically said, I oppose, when I was working for him, I oppose essentially where Theresa May is going, and I oppose above all where Philip Hammond is going. So you're working for three different senior ministers and you know they're not remotely in the same place. So I understood where Johnson was. But he wanted a strongly divergent mid-Atlantic deregulatory Brexit. I don't think he fully knew what it meant. And when, I and others sort of said, yeah, but there's Ireland, and there's a rather fundamental trilemma here. And there is no easy and good and perfect solution to that trilemma. And this is what the trilemma is. And this is where it lands you. It was all kind of, just don't give me that crap. I mean, I'm not interested in that. That's completely second order. We'll deal with that when we have to deal. And in fairness to her, whatever one thought of her, that was not her approach. And she recognized this was a fundamental issue and a fundamental challenge. And in the end, she thought of herself as the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And that was true of all four predecessors who, as I say, devoted more to the Irish peace process and more to the Irish question than any other, certainly than any other foreign policy issue. I obviously regard it as a domestic policy issue, not a foreign policy issue. That's gone, and the bureaucratic expertise that went with it and the deep knowledge is gone. So it worries me. I think they anyway have a wrong-headed conception of what the Good Friday Agreement is and what it meant and what it means. And as I say, and the kind of, and Bridget would be far better versed than me in kind of their conception of what consent covers and what it doesn't cover. So I think there is this rather cavalier plus ignorant. I don't think the system would want to be cavalier, and there are very good people, certainly in the Northern Ireland system, who understood it. Andrew McCormick, who produced very good evidence on Brexit, was one of them. Is that there at the top of Whitehall? I can't honestly say it is. No, I don't think it is. That's what worries me. I think cavalierness and insouciance at best, or dishonesty at the top, matched by sort of bureaucratic lack of background, lack of knowledge, lack of depth, lack of history. The same applies on the European Union. I feel like I'm kind of as old as Methuselah sometimes on the EU stuff, but I think quite a lot of simple institutional knowledge kind of died when I left, really, because there isn't anybody else who's been through 50 European councils and done loads of stuff in various different sectoral councils and understands what process looks like and how the other side might stitch together a process. There used to be more of that in the Foreign Office than there is. There isn't that much of that left in the Foreign Office. I don't want to disparage people. There's some very good people in the Foreign Office and very able people, but there isn't the depth of understanding of how this beast works that there is in other comparable systems in large countries.
Ivan, your presentation leaves me with a thought that's based really on the third point that you raised, but also on a very brilliant comment from one of our audience online, Bruce Chisholm, who's viewing this from Canada. And the thought is that you say we need to recognize the scale of the challenge to the policy framework at the global level. But it occurs to me as I listen to you that we probably need to recognize that challenge to the policy framework all the way down. Yeah. And that the weaknesses of that framework at any level of governance are what Vladimir Putin is exploiting. It is a challenge to our political system that we have to fail, or that we have to succeed in refuting systematically and comprehensively. And I think the takeaway in terms of research from your presentation, among many, is the governance agenda that we have to pursue. And as this is hosted by our global governance program, I cannot thank you enough for
Well, I want
leading
to put it on the table precisely, but I don't have answers. I'm not giving you answers. I've been a G20 Sherpa, an EU Sherpa, a G7 Sherpa, and a G8 Sherpa. I was the last G8 Sherpa because they abolished the G8 after me because of the Crimea. So I was the last person to chair a G8 process, and there won't be any of those. We, in the end, concluded that G7 was only suitable for kind of Western democracy fireside chats. Leaders liked it often more than the G20. Private, intimate, some serious discussions without notes, without loads of bureaucrats in the room, not formulaic. They liked it, but it lacked legitimacy. Why did we develop the G20? Gordon Brown, Paul Martin, all the people who authored the idea in the old days, and rightly so. G7 no longer legitimate, need global institutions, need global governance that works. I've written, John Cunliffe has written, many others have written within the system, global governance papers, conceptions of kind of what the architecture needed to be, what was missing, what would be both legitimate and efficient and effective. We had loads of those papers. It feels like a lifetime ago. It's only 10 years ago. The G20, we've got to accept, is simply not going to bear the weight. I mean, the G20 has been essentially, well before this crisis, pretty disappointing anyway since the financial crisis, and got bogged down in a lot of quite useful, but basically second-order stuff. But you never felt that it could manage a crisis in the way it probably did in 2009 and made a material difference. As I say, WTO, multilateralism, trade multilateralism. I worked on Chinese WTO accession in the 90s for Leon Britain. We worked closely with the Americans, but we worked, a lot obviously with the Chinese on getting them in. At that stage, it feels like now a brave new dawn of multilateralism. At that stage, there was a cloud no larger than a man's hand at the time of Seattle, 1999. And you started to see the first ripples of kind of anti-free trade sentiment, really on the left, not the right. You would never have predicted then, I certainly wouldn't have predicted that. I thought there was trouble coming then, because I thought that trade policy was getting into more and more neuralgic areas closer to sovereignty and closer to people's real values. But I thought all the trouble was going to come from the left. The trouble has actually come from, the Trumpite right and from the right here. I mean, the right in the UK talks as if it is kind of free trading and liberal, but it isn't really. It's quite nativist and quite protectionist. And look at their instincts on, public procurement or competition. Actually, they're not terribly liberal. So, but the WTO doesn't do it anymore. You can't expect major multilateral negotiations to get anywhere. Leon Britain was the guy who authored the first speech which argued in favour of what became the Doha Round. I was part of writing that speech in 1996. We were thinking, replace the gap with the WTO, has more legal teeth, multilateral framework, bring the Chinese in. Leon was also trying to deliver a transatlantic single market proposition, which failed, obviously, in the 90s. But these were sort of heady days of more trade liberalisation. Where do we go next beyond the world of tariffs? And I suppose my point is, I don't look at the world and think, well, yeah, that's coming back. That's not the world I inhabit anymore. But when I look at the world that my ex-colleagues are in other countries as well as the UK, you think, well, they're now putting a big load on the G7 because there's nothing else alive. The UK quite likes the G7 because it gets to chair it once in a while and because it doesn't have the EU name on it. But even Liz Truss is saying the G7 has no institutional framework, no institutional machinery. The merit of the G7 for the leaders was, as I say, fireside chats, light touch, Sherpas only, and no follow-up. Individual presidencies could have their own initiatives, and then light touch follow-up of previous presidencies' initiatives, but that was it. Well, that's never going to bear the load of the kind of issues that I think now the Western world has to talk about really seriously together. So where are we going to do that? Now, I'm fairly agnostic about that, particularly obviously as a Brit. I mean, I am not totally agnostic about it, but I recognise that sell it to a British government, anything which has a kind of complete EU badge on it. At the moment, they want to avoid being in the room with Big Brother or ex-Big Brother. David Frost was obsessed with this. In my view, he was obsessed with it because they were scared to death of being beaten up consistently by the EU in a room and therefore wanted to keep the agenda and the institutional setup of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement as light as possible. You're never going to get Boris Johnson off that vision, which is, I don't want to be constantly beleaguered and belaboured by the EU side in rooms I don't want to be in with these people. So you can't break through that. But when you look at the plethora of issues that the Western world now has to confront and to get serious on, it's not just the Western world as well. It's obviously, I probably shouldn't describe it as the Western world because it certainly includes the Japanese and some other Asian countries. There's obviously a big question about India's role and whether India has a foot in both camps. But if you're trying to look at the kind of issues I'm just trying to flesh out here, I'm asking myself the question, well, we haven't got anything. which actually enables senior bureaucrats working for leaders. It has to be sort of Sherpa-driven in the way that EU work has to be Sherpa-driven, because otherwise it isn't close enough to leaders' offices. It therefore has to be able to get into leaders' offices, because ultimately those are the only people who can take the decisions. But there then has to be an architecture beneath that. I know this sounds terribly boring, but I'm hoping at global governance institutions I can get away with it. There has to be an architecture beneath that that sort of works and enables decision making to happen in each of the kind of sovereign states or sovereign regions, but then brings it together and says, okay, so we're going to do that then. And that's what it looks like. And this is what we really wanted on data protection and privacy. This is what you really wanted, but this is the legal framework and this is the legal agreement that works for us both. So it seems to me there's some elements of that coming together in the EU-US Trade and Technology Council, and it's good that they managed to do a data deal, and we'll see whether the European Court of Justice throws it out again. But there's quite a lot that obviously needs doing that isn't getting done, and I don't think you could do it solely on a G7 framework.
Well, on that note, we're slightly over time, so I'm going to call a close to our proceedings, but I want to thank all of you who remain online for your participation in this. It's been great having you as an audience. Thanks to those of you in the room. Thanks to everyone who posed questions, but most of all, Ivan, thanks to you. This has been a really terrific experience. Thank you.